They tried to auction her baby for 10 coins, until a giant rancher took the basket and said, no. The sun beat down on the Brightwater auction yard, turning the dust into a pale, shimmering haze as townsfolk gathered around the wooden platform where horses, tools, and broken furniture were usually sold. But today, something far worse lay at the center. A woven willow basket sat on the table, its handles frayed, its blanket thin and patched, and inside it, a tiny baby fussed weakly, fists trembling in the heat. Men shifted forward, coins already clinking in their palms. Women whispered in tight knots, some turning away, others leaning in with morbid curiosity. 10 coins to start, barked Milo Taves, the auction runner, a wiry man with a face pinched by greed and a vest too small for his swollen pride. He slapped his hand against the table next to the basket. Come on now. Child eats too much to keep, mother too weak to earn her keep. Best she let someone else take him. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The baby whimpered again, a thin, helpless sound that should have broken hearts, but instead only tightened fists and narrowed eyes. At the edge of the platform, the mother stood barefoot in a torn calico dress, her hair loose and tangled, her face streaked with dust and tears. She held her arms close to her chest, as if she could still feel the weight of her child, even though he'd been ripped from her minutes ago. Please, she choked out, stepping forward. He's all I have. Please don't do this. Milo snapped his fingers, and 2 men shoved her back. Quiet, Lena. You had your chance to pay what you owe. I don't owe you anything, she cried, stumbling but catching herself on shaking legs. You forged those papers. Everyone knows it. But no one stepped in. No one even looked at her. Milo clapped his hands sharply. Bid starts now. 10 coins. For a moment, nobody moved. Then a hand rose, then another and another, as if a baby were livestock, nothing more. Lena gasped a broken sound, the kind that slipped from a person who had already lost everything and was now watching the last piece of her soul being weighed like firewood. Stop, she sobbed, rushing forward again. Please, he's hungry. He just needs time. I can work. I can... Her plea shattered when one of the bidders laughed. Work? You can barely stand. Another lifted a silver coin and shouted, 10! Milo slammed his hand down. 10 coins. Do I hear? The crowd split suddenly, startled. A shadow fell across the platform, not the shadow of dusk, but the shadow of a man large enough to block the sun. A giant rancher strode forward, boots striking the planks with slow, thunderous certainty. Broad as a barn door, shoulders like cut stone, beard dark and heavy, eyes steady beneath the brim of his hat. The kind of man townsfolk usually made space for without realizing it. His name was Caleb Ward. He didn't look at the bidders. He didn't look at Milo. He looked only at the basket, at the red-faced, sweating baby reaching toward the sky with tiny, pleading fists. The rancher stepped onto the platform without permission or invitation. Milo sputtered. Sir, you can't just... This is illegal. Caleb ignored him entirely and reached down, lifting the basket with both hands, careful, gentle, as if the woven willow carried something sacred instead of something discarded. Lena made a sound like a choked sob, covering her mouth as her knees buckled. Caleb turned slowly to face the crowd, the baby's cries softening the moment his massive hands steadied the basket. His voice rumbled low and quiet, but the whole yard heard it. No. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply said the word like a mountain refusing to move. Murmurs exploded. Milo lunged forward. You can't take him. He's not yours. He's... Caleb's gaze cut to him, calm but cold enough to snap bone. He ain't yours either. The rancher lifted the basket against his chest and stepped off the platform, each stride echoing with the certainty of a man who would not yield. Behind him, Lena whispered through her tears, Please, don't let them take him. Please. Caleb turned, his massive silhouette framed by the glare of midday sun. They won't touch him again, he said. Not while I'm standing. And in the stunned silence that followed, the auction died before anyone realized it was already over. Caleb didn't move fast. He didn't need to. His strides were slow, deliberate, each one carved with the kind of certainty that made men rethink whatever orders they'd been about to shout. The baby's cry softened as Caleb adjusted the basket against his chest, shielding the infant from the sun with one broad arm. Lena stumbled after him, breathless and shaking, her fingers twitching like she wanted to reach for her child, but was too terrified of what might happen if she tried. Behind them, Milo finally snapped out of his stupor. "Stop him! Stop that man!" he shrieked, waving his hands like a mad rooster. But the townsfolk hesitated. Nobody wanted to be the first to grab the giant rancher with shoulders as wide as a wagon bed and a jaw set tighter than a locked barn. Caleb didn't look back once, not when Milo grabbed two men by the sleeves, not when someone yelled, "He's stealing the baby!" Not even when boots thundered toward them. He walked with the calm of a man who had carried heavier burdens than greed and cowardice. "Caleb, please!" Lena gasped as she caught up to him, her breath hitching. "They'll chase us. They always do." "Not today," he said simply, shifting the basket to one arm long enough to offer her his hand. She hesitated, but only for a heartbeat, before gripping his forearm, letting him pull her forward with surprising gentleness. They broke through the edge of the crowd just as Milo found his voice again. 10 coins, he shouted desperately. "That's the price. Anybody who helps him is stealing from the town. Somebody get the sheriff." But no one moved. Some backed away. Some looked at their boots. A few women stared with something like hope flickering behind their pity, because none of them had dared do what Caleb had just done, but every single one of them had wanted someone too. Caleb reached the hitching posts and stopped, because 3 men stepped into their path, rough-looking drifters who had been eyeing the basket like vultures waiting for a calf to drop. Their leader, a narrow-eyed man with a scar across his cheek, jabbed a finger toward the baby. "That ain't yours," he growled. Caleb's voice stayed low, steady. "Ain't yours either." "We paid Milo," the scarred man spat. "We put in our 10 coins. Then you wasted 'em." Caleb shifted his stance, not aggressive, but undeniably immovable. The baby stirred, letting out a tiny whimper. Lena pressed a hand to her mouth, eyes wide, heart pounding so hard she thought it might shake her apart. "Move," Caleb said, not loud, not angry, just a simple instruction from a man who had been patient long enough. The scarred man puffed up, looking like he might try a show of bravery, until Caleb stepped 1 inch closer. 1 inch was enough. The drifter swallowed, muttered a curse, and backed away. His friends followed. Caleb nodded once, then started walking again, guiding Lena toward the alley between the mercantile and the blacksmith shop. "This way," he said. "We lose the noise faster behind the stores." "But the sheriff," Lena whispered. Caleb's jaw tightened. "If he comes, he'll talk first. I can handle talk." But the pounding of running boots behind them told Lena talking wouldn't be the first thing Milo wanted. They slipped behind the mercantile, past crates and stacked flour bags, past a sweating mule tied to a post. Lena's legs nearly buckled. Caleb steadied her with the crook of his elbow, never loosening his hold on the basket. "You keep breathing slow," he murmured. "You're all right." She shook her head, tears spilling. "No, I'm not. Milo was going to sell my baby. My baby." Her voice cracked into a ragged sob. Caleb stopped, turning to her fully. Even in the shade, his presence filled the narrow alley like a wall of solid timber. "Look at me," he said. She lifted her eyes, trembling. Caleb lowered the basket just enough for her to see her child's tiny kicking foot beneath the blanket. "No one's taken him," he said, voice soft but deep enough to anchor her to the ground. "Not Milo, not his men, not the sheriff. Not anyone." "But how?" "Because I said no," he replied, calm as bedrock, "and I don't break my word." Behind them, Milo's furious voice exploded across the yard. "Find them. He can't have gotten far." Caleb gently touched Lena's elbow, guiding her deeper into the shadows. "Come on," he whispered. "We're getting your son out of this town." And as they slipped unseen between the buildings, Lena realized that for the first time since dawn, the terror in her chest had eased just enough to let something else flicker through, something she barely recognized. Hope. Caleb led Lena through the tight lattice of alleys behind the mercantile until they reached a sagging storage shed wedged between 2 weather-beaten buildings. The boards were gray with age, the door hanging crooked on a rusted hinge, but it was quiet, shaded from the street and hidden from Milo's frantic search. Caleb nudged the door open with his boot and gestured her inside. Dust motes drifted in the single beam of sunlight, spilling through a cracked board, floating above stacked crates, burlap sacks, and a broken wheelbarrow. "It ain't much," he murmured, "but it'll give us a moment." Lena stepped in first, pressing her back to the wall as Caleb closed the door behind them, leaving only a sliver of light to cut the dimness. Her breaths came too fast, rising and falling like waves that couldn't settle. Caleb set the baby's basket on a crate, checking the blanket, adjusting it with hands gentle enough to make Lena's knees weaken. "He's warm," Caleb said. "Strong cry. He'll be all right." The reassurance cracked something in her chest, something she'd been holding together with fear and desperation alone. "He shouldn't have been on that table," she whispered, voice shaking. "He shouldn't have been anywhere but with me." Caleb rested one big hand on the edge of the basket. "Then stick with me. You'll keep him with you." She wiped her cheeks, smearing dust with tears. "Milo said I was useless, that no one wants a woman who can't work fast enough. He said my baby was just another mouth on my debt." "Your debt ain't real," Caleb said with quiet certainty. "I know forged papers when I see 'em." Lena went still, breath catching. "He showed you the paper?" "Didn't need to. The way he carried himself told the truth." Lena's eyes fluttered closed as her shoulders sagged. "He took everything," she whispered. "My winter money, my sewing, what little food I had left. Then he said if I didn't pay more, he'd take my boy. I thought he was bluffing until this morning." Caleb clenched his jaw, the muscles ticking slow and dangerous. "Men like Milo ain't bluffers. They're cowards who hide behind excuses." A sudden thud sounded outside. A crate dropped or a boot hitting the side of the shed. Lena startled violently, gripping Caleb's sleeve. He steadied her instantly, moving between her and the sound, one hand hovering near his revolver. Voices drifted past the wall. "Check behind the smithy," one man yelled. "Milo's offer stands. 10 coins to whoever finds the kid." Another added, "Sheriff ain't coming till tomorrow. We got time." Caleb's jaw hardened. "They're searching everywhere," Lena whispered, panic rising again. "They won't stop until they grab him and run." Caleb looked back at the baby, tiny, unaware, his small fingers curled around the edge of the blanket, and then at Lena. "Then we won't be here when they circle back." "Where can we go?" she asked, voice breaking. "My legs are weak. I haven't eaten since yesterday. I don't know if I can—" Caleb placed a hand on the crate beside the basket and leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "You ain't gonna fall. I'll carry the baby. If you stumble, I'll carry you too." Her breath hitched, because no one had ever said something like that to her. Not even her late husband, who'd been kind but always stretched thin with work. The shed creaked as someone outside walked too close. Lena's heart leaped into her throat. Caleb gently touched her elbow. "Listen to me," he said, voice soft but unshakable. "You held your child through worse than this. You got him this far. You're stronger than they ever gave you credit for." The words struck her deeper than he could know. She nodded shakily, drawing a breath that actually reached her lungs this time. Caleb lifted the basket back into his arms, adjusting it carefully so the blanket shaded the baby from any glimpse of light through the door. Then he opened the shed door just an inch, peering out. The alley was empty now, quiet enough, but quiet in that dangerous way where the next noise could be a threat. "Stay close," he whispered, and Lena moved to his side without hesitation. Caleb stepped into the alley first, body angled to shield both her and the child. Behind them, the shed door swung shut with a soft groan, sealing the memory of fear inside. Ahead of them, sunlight spilled across the dust as if giving them a path. Lena gripped the back of Caleb's coat and whispered, "Where are we going?" Caleb glanced down at her, eyes steady as bedrock. "Someplace Milo will never think to look," he murmured, "and someplace no man will dare take your child again." Then, with the baby in his arms and Lena at his side, he led them into the deeper streets where hope, still faint, still trembling, waited for its chance to grow. Caleb guided Lena through the back streets until the town thinned behind them, the buildings shrinking into silhouettes against the widening prairie. They followed a narrow livestock path lined with scrub and broken fence posts, the kind of road nobody bothered with unless they were hauling hay or avoiding trouble, which made it perfect. The afternoon sun was still high, baking the earth into hard clay, and Lena's breaths came in short, uneven pulls as she hurried to keep pace. Caleb slowed immediately, shifting the basket to one arm and offering her the other. "Easy," he murmured, voice steady as a riverbed. "Ain't no good in rushing if you fall." She nodded, but her eyes kept darting over her shoulder as if Milo might leap out of the dust itself. "He'll tell the whole town I'm a thief," she whispered. "He'll say I abandoned my own child." Caleb's jaw flexed. Folks who believe him weren't worth calling neighbors anyway. They walked a few minutes more until they reached a dry creek bed, a shallow trench of pale sand and round stones sheltered by a leaning cottonwood tree. Caleb slowed to a halt. "Sit a minute," he said. "Catch your breath." She hesitated, glancing toward town again. "We shouldn't stop. We shouldn't." He knelt beside her as she sank to the cool sand, the basket resting between them. "Lena," he said softly, touching her forearm. "Your legs are shaking. Your boy needs you steady. 5 minutes won't get us caught." She pressed her hand over her eyes, swallowing the rising tide of panic. "I'm sorry," she murmured. "I keep slowing you down." Caleb's brow furrowed. "You don't apologize for being scared after what you've been through. Fear keeps folks alive." She let out a shaky laugh that dissolved into a sob. "I didn't think anyone would help us," she whispered. "I thought, when they put him on the table, I thought it was the end." Her fingers trembled as she reached into the basket, brushing the baby's cheek. He stirred, rooting lightly before drifting back to sleep. "They said I owed 10 coins, she continued, voice cracking. 10 coins for rent I already paid, 10 coins for firewood he never delivered, 10 coins for damages after the storm, 10 coins for existing." Caleb settled beside her, one knee in the sand, his silhouette blocking the harshest glare of the sun. "And when you couldn't pay, he said he'd take the boy," he finished quietly. "Said someone else could put him to better use." Lena hugged herself, shoulders curling in as if trying to hide from the memory. "I begged him," she whispered. "I offered to scrub every floor in his boarding house. I offered to sew for his wife. He just smiled and said I should have thought earlier about who I let into my bed." Her voice broke completely, shame pouring out like a wound finally tearing open. Caleb stilled. Then, very slowly, he reached out and touched her wrist, thumb brushing the thin blue vein beneath her skin. "There ain't a damn thing for you to be ashamed of," he said, voice low and fierce. "You tried to survive in a world that didn't want you to, and you kept your child alive when many wouldn't have lasted a week." She blinked at him through tears, stunned. "Thomas, my husband, he died last winter," she whispered. "Fever took him fast. I pawned my wedding brooch to buy medicine, but it didn't matter. After he passed, folks stopped looking me in the eye. Then Milo started showing up at the door." Caleb's hands curled into fists in the sand. "Widowhood ain't an invitation," he muttered. "Some men forget that." Lena looked down at the baby again. "I named him Evan," she said softly. "Thomas picked the name. We thought we had more time." Caleb's expression changed, something softer, deeper, like a storm breaking into rain. "Evan," he repeated quietly, as if committing it to memory. "Strong name," she nodded, wiping her cheeks. "I didn't want him to think the world was cruel from the moment he opened his eyes." Caleb let out a slow breath, gazing across the empty prairie. "Then we'll show him something better than cruelty." "We," she whispered. Caleb didn't flinch. "You're not walking this road alone anymore." The wind shifted, cooler now, brushing dust across their boots, and in that moment, something inside Lena that had been clenched tight since winter finally loosened. She leaned forward, brushing a hand across the baby's blanket, her voice barely a breath. "Thank you," she whispered, "for stepping in, for saying no when no one else would." Caleb rose, offering her his hand. "Rest's over," he said gently. "Danger don't stay still, and neither should we." She slipped her hand into his, and he pulled her to her feet with effortless strength, lifting the basket close to his chest once more. As they continued along the winding creek bed, leaving the shadows of the auction behind, Lena realized that the truth she had finally spoken had not broken her. It had freed her. And Caleb, quiet, steady, unshakable, walked beside her like a man determined to carry the pieces until she could stand whole again. They had barely cleared the far edge of the creek bed when Caleb stopped so abruptly that Lena nearly walked into his back. The air shifted, not with wind, but with tension. A dust plume rose on the ridge above them, carrying the unmistakable silhouette of 3 riders pushing their horses hard. Caleb's eyes narrowed. "Milo's men," he said quietly. Lena's heart lurched into her throat. How did they find us?" "We left tracks," Caleb answered, scanning the land with quick calculation. "A basket, a tired mother, a big man. Easy trail to follow if you know the land." The riders spotted them at the same moment, one of them hollering loud enough to echo down the dry wash. "There, down the creek bed. Don't let him get any farther." Lena stumbled backward, clutching her chest as panic surged fast and violent. "Caleb, they'll take him, please." Caleb turned to her sharply, steadying her shoulders with those massive hands that felt like anchors in a storm. "Look at me," he said. She did, her breaths trembling out in quick bursts. "I said no one takes your boy," he reminded her, voice low, fierce, and utterly calm. "And I meant it." He picked up the basket and handed it to her this time, pressing the handles firmly into her grip. "Hold him close. Stay right behind me and keep to the wall of the wash." She hesitated. She'd never carried the baby while running from danger before, but she tightened her hold immediately, nodding with shaky resolve. Caleb brushed a quick hand along the blanket, making sure Evan was tucked deep from the sun and dust. "Good. Don't stop unless I tell you." Then he turned toward the ridge with the kind of slow, deliberate composure that made Lena think of a bear waking, quiet, heavy, and unstoppable. The riders were closing fast, their shouts bleeding into the wind. "Stop or we fire!" one yelled. "Hand over the kid and no one gets hurt!" Caleb didn't even pretend to listen. "Move," he murmured to Lena, and they began walking swiftly along the creek bed, though every instinct in her screamed to run. But Caleb didn't run. He paced the distance with controlled, calculated steps, watching the ridge as though waiting or measuring. The first rider, the one with a gray hat and mean, narrow eyes, reached the drop first. Instead of slowing, he tried to cut directly down the slope, kicking his horse hard. Bad choice. Caleb muttered under his breath, "Fool." The animal skidded on loose shale, sliding sideways before regaining footing with a frantic snort. The delay bought them only a few seconds, but seconds mattered. "Keep to the wall," Caleb said, shifting slightly to give Lena room. She hugged the basket, moving as fast as her aching body allowed. "Caleb, what do they want with him?" she gasped. 10 coins ain't worth chasing us out of town." Caleb's stare stayed fixed ahead. "Milo hates being embarrassed. Men like him would rather burn down a barn than admit someone said no." The riders finally reached level ground, spreading out, one behind, 2 flanking from higher ground. "Reckon you should hand him over," Gray Hat shouted. "He ain't yours to take." Caleb didn't bother turning, "and he sure as hell ain't yours to sell." One rider cocked his rifle. Lena froze in pure terror. Caleb didn't. In one smooth motion, he scooped a fist-sized stone from the creek bed, turned, and hurled it with such force that it whistled through the air like a thrown hammer. It struck the rifle barrel mid-lift, knocking it sideways with a metallic crack. The rider yelped, nearly dropping the weapon. The shock was enough to stall all 3 men. Caleb stepped forward, placing himself squarely between them and Lena, his frame blocking her completely. "Last warning," he growled. "Ride back, or I make you regret your boots ever touched this dirt." The gray hat rider, face red with humiliation, spat and raised his gun again. But before he could aim, another voice cut through the tension, a voice from farther off, the sheriff. "Hold your fire!" Sheriff Dalton rode up on a lathered horse, eyes blazing with fury, not at Caleb but at the men who had chased him. "What in the blazes do you boys think you're doing?" he thundered. The riders stiffened instantly. Milo had lied. Dalton wasn't out of town, and he didn't look pleased. Caleb didn't relax, not even a fraction. The sheriff reined in his horse beside them, chest heaving. "Caleb," he said, "you best explain why Milo's men claim you stole a child." Caleb motioned to Lena gently. "Ask her." Dalton turned to the trembling widow. "Ma'am, is that your baby?" Lena tightened her hold on the basket, voice shaking but clear. "He's mine. Milo tried to sell him." Dalton's face went cold as stone. He exhaled a slow, dangerous breath. Then he looked at the riders. "Boys, you might want to start explaining before I decide which cell you'll be sleeping in." For the first time since morning, the danger shifted off them. But Caleb didn't lower his guard. Not yet. Because a man like Milo wouldn't accept defeat, not without striking back louder than before. Sheriff Dalton didn't waste time. The moment the riders stammered out their excuses, half lies, half fear, he ordered them back to town with a glare sharp enough to cut rope. "And if Milo so much as breathes near this woman again, I'll chain him to his own porch," the sheriff barked before sending them galloping off with their pride dragging behind their horses' tails. The second they disappeared over the ridge, Dalton turned to Caleb and Lena with a weary sigh. "I'll handle the legal filth," he promised. "Milo's forged debts won't stand. But you two, you best leave this stretch of land for now. He's a petty man. Petty men do stupid things when humiliated." Caleb nodded once. "We already planned on going." Dalton tipped his hat to Lena, voice softening. "Ma'am, I'm sorry the town failed you." Lena swallowed hard, blinking back fresh tears. "Thank you, Sheriff." With one last look of warning toward the horizon, Dalton rode off, leaving a silence that felt like the world finally exhaling. Caleb turned to Lena. "We keep moving." She nodded, though her legs trembled so badly she swayed. Caleb's arms moved instantly. He lifted the basket with ease and touched her elbow with quiet care. "My cabin ain't far," he said. 2 miles north past that rise. You'll be safe there." She didn't know what a cabin meant. Shelter, a bed, warmth. All she knew was the word safe, and she clung to it the way she clung to Evan's tiny blanket. The land shifted as they walked. The dusty creek bed gave way to rolling grass, then scattered boulders, then a cluster of pines whispering in the wind. The sun mellowed toward late afternoon, turning the hills gold. But Lena's strength faded with each step until she finally stumbled near a fallen log. Caleb caught her instantly, steadying her with one arm while supporting the baby with the other. Effortless, as though he'd been built for carrying what the world couldn't. "Sit," he said gently. "Just a moment." She did, collapsing onto the log with a soft gasp. "I'm sorry," she whispered again. "You keep having to stop for me." Caleb crouched beside her, resting the basket carefully on the grass. "I told you before," he replied, voice low and warm. "You don't apologize for being worn out. You're running on fear and a day without food. Anyone would buckle." Her stomach tightened painfully at the mere mention of food. She hadn't eaten since dawn, hadn't really eaten in days. Caleb noticed. Without a word, he reached into the leather satchel slung across his shoulder and pulled out a folded cloth bundle. When he unwrapped it, the smell of fresh bread filled the air, dense, warm, still soft from the morning hearth. Lena stared at it as though it were a miracle. I can't take your food," she whispered, shrinking back. Caleb tore off the largest piece and placed it gently in her hands. "It's not mine," he said. "It's meant for you." She hesitated. Then hunger overpowered her pride. She bit into the bread, tears filling her eyes at the taste. Caleb watched her without pity, only with a steady patience that made the shame lighten rather than deepen. "Slow," he warned softly. "Small bites. You'll make yourself sick if you rush." She followed his instructions, nibbling carefully as the bread soothed the hollow ache inside her. Evan stirred in the basket, letting out a soft cry. Caleb leaned in, adjusting the blanket and touching the baby's tiny cheek. "He's hungry too," Caleb murmured. Lena nodded, setting the bread aside long enough to cradle her son and help him feed. The humbleness of the moment, mother and child beneath a pine, a giant rancher kneeling beside them, felt like something sacred. When Evan settled again, Caleb offered her water from his canteen. She drank gratefully, wiping her lips with the back of her hand. "Why are you being so kind to us?" she whispered. The question hung between them, fragile and honest. Caleb looked at her for a long moment, eyes the color of dark earth, steady and unreadable. "Because someone should have been," he said, simple, true, and devastating in its clarity. He stood then and extended his hand to her. "Come on. Cabin's close." She took his hand, not out of fear this time, but out of something gentler. Trust. As they crested the next hill, Caleb pointed toward a small valley where a lone cabin stood tucked against the trees, smoke curling faintly from the chimney. A place untouched by Milo's cruelty, untouched by the auction yard's noise, a place that looked like a life. "There," Caleb said quietly. That's home for now. And for the first time in months, the word home didn't hurt Lena's heart. It warmed it. By the time they reached the foot of the valley, the shadows of the pines stretched long across the grass, though daylight still burned clear and golden. The cabin sat ahead, solid timber walls, a stone chimney, a small garden patch fenced with rough-hewn rails, but the safety it promised was shattered by the sound of horses somewhere behind them. Not close, but not far enough. Caleb stiffened instantly, every line of his body sharpening into alert stillness. "They're sweeping the valley," he murmured, listening to the echo of hooves. "Smaller group, maybe 2 riders. Milo isn't done yet." Lena clutched the basket tight, panic flaring. "But the sheriff, he warned them." "Men like Milo don't hear warnings," Caleb cut in quietly. "They hear challenges." His gaze swept the land, assessing the slope, the wind, the angle of the sun, calculating the best way to move unseen. "We can't go straight to the cabin," he decided. "They'll spot us from the ridge." Lena swallowed hard. "What do we do?" Caleb pointed to the right where a wooden footbridge arched across a narrow gorge cut by spring water. The bridge was old, weathered, its planks bowed with age. "Cross there," he said. "Once we're over, they'd have to circle half a mile to reach us. Gives us distance." Her heart kicked with fear. The bridge looked like it hadn't held weight in years. "Is it safe?" she whispered. Caleb didn't lie. "Safe enough if we move slow." A shuddering breath escaped her. She adjusted her hold on the basket, hugging Evan close. Caleb's voice gentled. "You can do this," he said, placing a steadying hand on her back. "I won't let you fall." They hurried toward the bridge, boots crunching over gravel. Wind brushed the grass in slow waves, carrying the sound of distant shouting. They had been spotted. Lena stepped onto the bridge first, wood creaking beneath her weight. She froze instantly. It's going to break. I can't, Caleb, I can't." "Lena," Caleb said firmly, stepping behind her, his presence wrapping around her like armor. "Keep your eyes on the far side, not the boards." She nodded, breath quivering, and took a step. The plank groaned but held. Another step, then another. Caleb kept one hand hovering near her back, the basket shielded by his body from the wind. Halfway across, the bridge swayed under a gust. Lena let out a choked gasp, gripping the rope railing with white-knuckled fear. Evan stirred, fussing softly at the sudden movement. "Don't stop," Caleb urged. "Stop and scares you more." "Keep going." She forced her legs to move, one shaking step after the other. Every creak sounded like the world splitting open. Every sway felt like the ground giving way beneath them. But she moved, guided by his voice, anchored by his steady breath behind her. When her boot finally hit solid earth on the far side, her knees buckled. Caleb caught her before she could fall, pulling her gently away from the edge. She collapsed into the grass, trembling violently. Caleb knelt beside her, studying her face with a kind of quiet awe. "That," he murmured, "took more courage than anything Milo's men will ever understand." She tried to speak, but her throat was too tight. Tears spilled silently down her cheeks instead. Caleb brushed a thumb across her cheekbone, soft as the wind. "You're stronger than fear," he said. "Remember that." The moment was cut short by distant hoofbeats slamming through the valley. Caleb snapped back into readiness. "They'll reach the bridge soon," he said, "and they'll think twice before crossing it at speed." Lena looked up at him, her breath unsteady. "What happens if they cross anyway?" Caleb stood tall, picking up the basket with one hand while offering her the other. "Then I'll deal with them before they get to you." His tone held no bravado, only certainty. She slipped her hand into his, rising shakily. "We need to reach the cabin," he said. "Once we're inside, I can hold them off as long as needed." Lena nodded, absorbing strength through his grip. Together they moved toward the cabin. The path ahead glowed gold beneath the sinking sun, but danger pressed from behind like a gathering storm. Lena held Evan to her chest, whispering a promise into his hair, one she wasn't sure she could keep on her own. But Caleb, he wasn't a promise. He was proof. And as they climbed the slope toward the cabin, she realized courage didn't come from being unafraid. It came from knowing someone would stand in front of you when fear closed in. Caleb had already chosen his place. Now it was time for her to trust that choice. The cabin's porch groaned softly under their boots as Caleb guided Lena up the steps, his hand steady at her back, the basket still tucked securely against his chest. From here, the valley spread wide and open, the golden grass rippling like a restless sea. But the moment his boots hit the planks, Lena felt something shift. A quietness, a belonging, a strange sense that this porch had been waiting for them long before today. Caleb set the basket down by the door and stepped out onto the porch rail, scanning the ridge. The riders appeared moments later, cresting the hill in a jagged line, their silhouettes black against the sun. 2 men, Milo's favorites, trouble with spurs. They pulled up hard when they spotted the small cabin. One of them shouted, "We know you're there, Hart! Hand over the woman and the kid!" Lena flinched at the sound of her baby's fate thrown into the wind like a threat. Caleb didn't flinch. He didn't even lift his voice. "This ain't your land," he called back. "Ain't your business. Turn around." The riders laughed, a brittle, ugly sound. "Milo says that child is town property," the first man yelled. "His debt, his right." Caleb stepped off the porch slowly, deliberately, until he stood at the edge of the yard, the earth solid beneath his boots. "Milo's rights end where mine begin," he said, "and they sure as hell end where a mother's tears start." The rider scoffed. "Save your poetry. The widow signed those papers fair, and the sheriff ain't here to argue." Lena swallowed hard. Her voice rose before she even realized she'd spoken. "They're forged," she cried. "He threatened me until I signed. He lied about the debt. He took my savings. He said my baby wasn't worth feeding unless he owned him." The second rider faltered, glancing at his partner. The first man sneered. "Words don't matter. Paper does." Caleb didn't bother replying. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out the crumpled sheet Milo had shoved at him earlier, a paper he'd grabbed when chaos erupted. He held it high so they could see the jagged signatures. "This?" Caleb said. "This ain't worth the ink it's written with." And in one clean motion, he tore it straight down the middle. The riders jerked as if he'd cut a rope binding them. Lena gasped. Everything Milo had used to control her ripped in half in the sunlight. You can't do that," the first man sputtered. "The debt ain't real," Caleb said. "Never was." The men exchanged panicked looks, realizing the ground beneath them had shifted. Officially or not, Caleb had just undone Milo's strongest weapon. "If Milo wants to argue," Caleb added, voice like thunder rolling low, "he can drag himself up here, but he better come quick and 'cause the sheriff's riding circles around town asking questions." That shook them. Hard. The bravado cracked. The second rider cleared his throat. We just came for the kid, didn't want no trouble." Caleb's expression didn't change. "Trouble found you anyway." The riders hesitated, still wavering in their saddles. The first man tried one last attempt, voice cracking. "Milo's paying, 10 coins each. You're throwing away good money protecting a stranger." Caleb took a single step forward. The men's horses jittered nervously. "She ain't a stranger," he said quietly, each word carved with certainty. "Not anymore." The weight of the statement hung in the air like a bell tolling across the valley. Lena's breath caught, her chest tightening with something she couldn't name yet. Not fear, not shame, something warmer, something grounding. The second rider looked at Lena, really looked, and something flickered across his face. Unease, maybe even guilt. "Look," he muttered, "we weren't going to hurt the kid." Caleb's eyes burned steady. "But you would have taken him, and that's the same thing." Silence slid between them, heavy, uncompromising. Then the first rider spat in the dirt and yanked his reins. "Fine, you keep him, but this ain't over." Caleb didn't move as they turned their horses and galloped back up the ridge. He watched until their figures vanished into the glare, until the dust they kicked up dissolved back into the quiet wind. Only then did he turn to Lena. She stood frozen beside the basket, one hand gripping the porch rail for strength, tears streaking her cheeks, not from fear this time, but from something deeper. Release. Caleb walked up the steps, slow enough not to startle her, and crouched beside Evan's basket. "He's safe," he murmured. "You both are." Lena's voice broke. "You tore the paper," she whispered. "You tore the only thing Milo had over me." Caleb lifted his gaze to hers. "I tore a lie," he said softly. "The truth stays." It was on that porch, bathed in clean daylight, surrounded by the quiet hum of pines, that everything shifted. Not just safety, not just survival. but the beginning of something Lena hadn't felt in a long, long time. Belonging. Night never came on this part of the frontier without warning. Shadows crept fast and temperatures fell even faster, but Caleb refused to let darkness own this moment. He ushered Lena and the baby inside the cabin first, making sure Evan was settled in a woven basket near the fire pit, then stepped back outside before she could protest. The sky was still bright with late afternoon sunlight, clear enough for trouble to find its way back if it dared. And trouble did. The sound of galloping hooves burst across the valley like distant thunder. Caleb stepped off the porch, shoulders squared, expression carved from stone. Lena appeared behind him in the doorway, clutching the frame with both hands, her heart climbing into her throat. "Stay inside," he murmured without turning, his voice gentler than his stance. She stayed, but she didn't step back. She couldn't. Through the shimmering heat of the valley, one rider broke into view, pushing his horse with reckless fury, Milo. The man reined in hard at the base of the slope, nearly throwing himself off the saddle with indignation. "You think you can embarrass me in front of my own town?" he shouted, face blotched with rage. Caleb didn't answer. He let the wind do the talking. Milo jabbed a finger toward the cabin. "She's mine. Her debt is mine. That kid—" Caleb stepped forward once, just once, and Milo's voice cracked like a boy caught lying. "You tore my paper," he sputtered. "That's theft." Caleb's jaw tightened. "No," he said, "this is theft." He pulled out the shredded contract, what remained of it, and dropped it into the dirt. The sunlight caught the pieces like bits of broken bone. Then he ground them into the soil beneath his boot. Lena gasped softly in the doorway, her hand flying to her mouth. Milo looked as if someone had driven a nail through his pride. "I'll see you jailed for that," he screeched. "You hear me? Jailed!" Caleb tilted his head slightly, eyes narrowing, not in anger, but in disappointment. "You think jail's where you belong?" he asked quietly. "No, jail's too clean for a man who'd sell a baby." Milo froze. The accusation hit like a hammer. Caleb continued, voice low and steady. "You forged her debt, you stole her money, you threatened her home, and when she couldn't pay what you invented, you tried to take her child. That ain't business, that's rot." Milo sputtered. You have no proof." Caleb's voice slammed into the air, a quiet thunder. "I'm the proof." Milo's mouth snapped shut. The valley held its breath. Caleb took 2 more steps down the slope, closing the distance until Milo had to tilt his chin up to meet his gaze. "You know what justice looks like out here?" Caleb asked. "It ain't a jail, it ain't a judge, it's a man finally being told no." Milo flinched. His bravado shook, but like all cowards, he gave one last desperate swing of cruelty. "Women like her," he spat, pointing toward Lena, "are meant to be owned. That's the order of things." Caleb didn't strike him, didn't raise a hand. He simply stepped aside, revealing Lena behind him. Milo blinked, startled. He hadn't seen her move forward. She stood barefoot on the porch, baby in her arms, sunlight catching her hair. Her voice shook, but not from fear. "I am not yours," she said. "Not your debt, not your property, not your anything." Milo's face twisted. "You're nothing." "Then why?" she asked softly. "Do you chase nothing across half the valley?" Milo staggered, unable to answer. Caleb nodded faintly, proud. "Time for you to leave," he told Milo. "You come back and you're not facing me. You're facing the sheriff and every woman you've ever lied to." Milo's eyes darted, searching for a foothold, a weapon, a word that could save him. But there was nothing left. His lies were torn. His threats were hollow. And the truth, spoken by the woman he tormented, was heavier than any fist Caleb could throw. Slowly, Milo mounted his horse. "This ain't finished," he choked out. Caleb didn't blink. "Yes," he said softly, "it is." Milo kicked his horse and rode off, the dust behind him rising like the final breath of a dying fire. The valley grew quiet again. Caleb climbed the steps back to the porch. His gaze meeting Lena's, something warm and grounding settling between them. "You did that," he told her. "Not me." She shook her head, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. "No," she whispered. "You gave me the courage to speak." Caleb reached out, brushing a thumb across her cheek, not wiping tears, but acknowledging them. Courage was already there. he murmured. I just held the line until you could step forward. Lena held Evan close and breathed in the clean daylight. For the first time, fear wasn't what filled her chest. Home was. Caleb's home, their home, if she found the strength to claim it. The question hovered in the warm air. What came next? And for once, Lena wasn't afraid to find out. The valley felt different once Milo's dust trail disappeared into the distance. Quieter, cleaner, as if the land itself had been waiting for someone to finally tell the man no. Caleb stood on the porch a moment longer, letting the stillness settle into his bones before turning to Lena, who stood in the doorway with Evan cradled close. Sunlight softened the worry lines on her face, turning her hair warm gold and giving the child a halo of brightness he hadn't seen all day. Let's get you inside, Caleb murmured. He opened the door fully and stepped aside so she could enter. Lena moved slowly across the threshold, hesitantly at first, as if afraid she didn't deserve to touch a place that felt so safe. But the moment her bare feet met the wooden floor, relief washed over her like a tide. The cabin smelled of cedar. Dry herbs hung from the rafters and bread cooling on a counter. It was modest, quiet, lived in, but another kind of quiet, nothing like the silence she'd known after her husband died. This quiet felt like an embrace. Caleb set her basket on the small table beside the hearth, making sure it was well away from any draft. You can sit, he said softly. She did, lowering herself onto the chair with a trembling exhale. Evan stirred in her arms, rooting softly as if sensing calm for the first time that day. Caleb knelt beside them, placing one steady hand on the chair's edge, close enough for her to feel his warmth. He's safe, he repeated. Both of you are. Lena swallowed hard. I don't know how to repay you, she whispered. Caleb frowned lightly, shaking his head. You don't. There ain't a ledger between us. There's always a ledger, Lena murmured, staring at the fire. At least, that's what Milo said. Caleb rested his forearm on his knee. Then Milo never knew what it meant to care. The words struck deep. She blinked fast, fighting tears, not of fear, but gratitude. Caleb, she whispered, I haven't felt human in months. He lifted his gaze to hers, something gentler softening his rugged features. You ain't just human, he said quietly. You're strong. Stronger than you know. She looked down at Evan, brushing a thumb over his tiny fist. I want him to grow up somewhere honest, she whispered. Somewhere men don't lie about owning people. Somewhere he sees kindness before cruelty. Caleb's breath eased out slow. A good place to start, he murmured, is a home. Lena's head lifted. A home, he nodded. This one, if you want it. Cabin's got room, land's got more. You and the boy can stay as long as you need. Her heart clenched. I don't want to be a burden. You ain't, he said simply. She hesitated, then looked deeper into his eyes, searching for anything false. She found none. What about you? She asked quietly. What do you want? Caleb paused, rubbing a thumb across the wood grain on the chair. Been a long while since wantin' did me any good, he admitted. But, his voice softened, I don't mind coming home to voices other than my own. Her breath caught. She looked around, the porch outside shimmering in late sunlight, the sturdy roof above them, the quiet hum of safety she'd never known. Caleb, she whispered, not trusting her voice, I don't want to leave. Something in his chest loosened at those words, though he tried not to show it. Then don't, he murmured. You can stay tonight, tomorrow, as long as it feels right. She nodded, tears falling freely now, silent but sure. Evan let out a soft sigh, curling into her. Lena gently tucked the blanket around him, then rose from the chair. She walked to the front door, stepping onto the porch, letting the last clean beam of daylight hit her face. Caleb followed, leaning silently against the railing beside her. This place, she said, voice trembling, feels more like home than any place I've ever been. Caleb's eyes softened. Then maybe it's time to build something real here. She smiled through her tears. With you? If you'll have me, he answered. The words hung between them, warm, steady, true. Lena looked at her child, at the porch beneath her feet, at the man who had stepped between her and every danger that dared reach for her. and she knew the answer. She took Caleb's hand. "Yes," she whispered. "We'll stay." Down in the valley, the last of the sunlight spilled across the world like a promise, bright and certain. And for the first time since her husband died, Lena felt the future waiting, not with fear, but with hope. If you were in her place, would you choose to stay or keep running? If you felt this story, like, share, and subscribe for more Redemption West tales, where mercy builds the homes cruelty tried to burn.